You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. Today's episode is number 40, and I've titled this Working with Humans. This is the fourth part of our series on developing your leadership foundations. Now, I've talked about some of these ideas in earlier podcasts, but I wanted to expand on them in this particular series. So why do we develop new skills of working? Well, we want to create focus and energy and momentum. And again, my goal is to help you build your leadership skills for both yourself and your organization, as we try to build ourselves into a new future. So as a review, the four parts of our series were first, the habits of mind. How do we organize our thinking? Habits of action. Literally, how do we find productive action? Then I talked about deep work or focused work and how do we really get the important work done that we need to do. And this one finally is, I called it earlier, skills to lead yourself and others, but I've now sort of think of it as working with humans. In other words, how do we work with other people to get the great work done that we're trying to do? In other words, how do you work with your teams, clients, and colleagues? So we'll go over four ideas, and these come from the emotional intelligence competencies, and they are self-awareness, empathy, organizational awareness, and coaching and mentoring. So we're going to be talking about these four items, and again, it goes back to some of the stuff I've done in earlier episodes, but again, we're trying to tie this together in this four-part series. Now, the whole idea of talking to humans, actually, I kind of stole from a book by an author by the name of Giff Constable, and he's got his book called Talking to Humans. Now, this book is actually intended for entrepreneurs where, people have a great idea and they want to try to start up a company. They think they have it all figured out, but they really haven't gone out yet to talk to customers to see if anybody's really interested. And in this book, Talking to Humans, he really talks about how do you get with people to find out whether your product is even really viable. Now, I'm going to switch up on this idea a little bit because I'm going to talk about talking and working with humans in the manufacturing world and other parts of business. Now, there's all kinds of ideas, there's all kinds of data, but this is going to be more about just the conversation piece of it. Because we can give people information, but at the end of the day, they're really not convinced by the information we give them. They're usually convinced by our conversations with them. Hence, this episode is How Do We Work with Humans? The four competencies I already mentioned we'll be talking about, but it builds on those four components of leadership that I think of: habits of thinking, habits of action, deep work, and here again, working with humans. So the first competency we'll talk about is emotional self-awareness. Are you aware of how you appear and come across to other people? The second one will be empathy. Are you really listening to people and understanding them? Third, we'll talk about organizational awareness. This is understanding the people in the organization, and it also has an element of systems thinking. Do we know how the whole system really works? Not just the org chart, but how do things really get done? And fourth, we'll talk about coaching and mentoring. These are key skills in today's world because we all need to work on workforce development, our own as well as new employees and our existing employees. You want to be developing those who are just starting with you and developing those who have been with you a long time. Everybody has to develop, so this coaching and mentoring really is an ongoing skill that you need to master. So stepping back to self-awareness, how do you do it? Again, I've shared this earlier in the podcast, but the key is to get feedback. How do you get feedback from people on how you come across, how you appear for people, and those kinds of things? You need to really understand, and you can try to look at it for yourself, and you can do some reflection, but in the end, it really takes other people to let you know. You can't really see yourself as you work. But in terms of things you can start on for reflection is think back on the last 5 conversations you've had. What was the tone of those conversations? What was the subject of them? Were they all places where you were advocating a position, or were there times when you were just building a relationship? And as you think back with some of your colleagues, have you even had 5 conversations with them, or has it just been email or text exchanges? So you might start with a trusted colleague and ask them about a previous conversation or maybe in a meeting. In other words, how did I come across in that meeting? Was there anything that struck you as really effective or really not useful in what I did in that meeting? But then this is an ongoing process, so you need to just keep track of how things are going, and you may want to engage with other people. The next competency is empathy. Do you have empathy for other people? And for me, a lot of this just comes down to listening. Are you really deeply listening to people? Are you listening? Or are you just preparing your answer for what they're saying? Are you listening unconditionally and non-judgmentally? And, could you be listening to ask clarifying questions, saying, help me understand more of this, as opposed to judging what they've said? So in my thinking, a lot of empathy is just listening. And I've often used this example, and I don't even know where I heard it first, but it comes from one of the countries in Africa where the greeting they use, translated to English, is, I see you. And for me, that always held something. Do I really see the other person? Do you see who you're interacting with? Do you see him as a person and not just a transaction of information? So again, this whole idea of empathy can be boiled down to, are you listening? And do you really see the other person? Are you present for them and paying attention? The third piece is organizational awareness. And again, for me, this has some elements of systems thinking. In other words, do you understand the network of how things get done in your organization? Who are the linchpins? Who are the people that really connect the dots for others, connect the conversations, connect the information flow? Who are the people that really facilitate when things are happening in your whole network or organization? And there are people that play that role. And so, it's one of those things that if you want to have a bunch of people find out something, you need to say, go talk to Susan. Susan, the person, she knows everyone and has connections with a wide variety of people. Or you may already perceive that there's disconnection in your organization. There may be two different groups that really aren't talking together effectively. For example, I've in the past, engineers and the shop floor supervisors just didn't always have a lot of good communications. One, they literally kind of spoke differently about things. The engineers tended to be very technical. The supervisors were more tactical as opposed to technical. So this whole idea of organizational awareness is knowing who knows what and who knows who. With that knowledge, then you can be sure that we have the right stakeholders involved in any particular conversation. And who are the key people that need to have their input heard on a particular decision? So again, as an example, it could be that we really need shop floor employees to weigh in on how some new procedure is impacting them, because we may have no understanding of what we've proposed and how it's really coming across or is they're trying to implement it. And we want them to be able to do their work in a great and safe manner. And it really, we have to understand how is it really impacting them. So it's not just about the org chart. This is about how does communication and how does the actual work get done. I've certainly, in my experience, we've started with a great idea at the top of the organization. As it moves down, it gets kind of fuzzily translated. And the farther down it goes, the less clarity there is. And so that the people on the front lines are saying, we don't understand it. We're not even sure how this is even going to help us or if it'll work at all. So the idea of is how do we look and see how the whole organization is getting connected. So the last one we were going to talk about is coaching and mentoring. And this gets back to earlier that we're all in the business of workforce development and we're all in the self-development business. As we walk forward into the future, we continually have to both improve ourselves and we have to help our people improve. We have to adopt new ideas, new technology, and new ways of thinking. And again, just as we've talked about in this series of new habits of thinking, new habits of action, how do we coach and mentor people so that they can adopt these things too? We talked about earlier about focus and deep work. So how do we do that for ourselves, but how do we help them get better at doing these same things? As we talk and work with people, fundamental thing is, are we helping them grow? I remember when I was working in the educational arena, and obviously they like to measure all kinds of things, whether it be grades or test scores or whatever. But a key question came up and we said, are we measuring something just to judge people? Or are we really measuring something to help people learn? So think about that in terms of the conversations you're having in a coaching and mentoring context. Are we judging people or are we helping them learn? And then again, as you give information, is this useful information? Is it going to help them be better, do something better, know something more? And an interesting thing that at least I've observed is as you move up in leadership, no longer are you coaching and mentoring people who do things such as individual contributors. You actually need to grow managers as coaches and mentors also. And I remember some years ago reading an article, this was about U.S. football, but they said the most successful head coaches in this sport were people who successfully grew their assistant coaches. Over time, those people who were growing great assistant coaches into great head coaches also actually had some of the most successful football programs. So again, at the higher levels of the organization, you're not only teaching yourself to grow, but you're teaching people to learn how to teach their people to grow and thrive. And again, this idea is about your broader responsibilities. Have you got the right people in the right place? The coaching, the mentoring, how do you really put that into play? So that sort of brings these 4 ideas into play on how do we work with humans. Again, as a contrast, it's not can I have a great PowerPoint presentation to share my wonderful knowledge with my colleagues, but how do we actually go about this process of talking and working with humans? So again, as always, I want to provide you some ideas for next steps or first steps. So in terms of self-awareness, as I mentioned earlier, think about some of your recent conversations and meetings. Just reflect on what was the tone of them? Were they effective? Could you think you could have done something better? Along with that, go out and ask a trusted colleague what they've noticed about how you come across in either conversations or meetings. What have they noticed that's effective or maybe less effective? As you think of empathy, just make an effort to be fully present and listen deeply in some of your conversations and see what you notice. So it may not work for you to do it every time, but pick out some conversations, pay attention, and after the conversation is over, make some notes to yourself. Was I present? Was I really listening to understand fully? In terms of organizational awareness, see if you think you can identify who are the key connectors in your organization. Who does everyone go to when they need to find out something? Think about where those people who are the connectors, maybe the people who know a wide range of people, or maybe the people have special knowledge. But look about what's the network look like, not just the organization chart. And then in coaching and mentoring, consider the question, how would you prepare someone to take your place? What would they need to know? What would they need to be able to do? So if you were actually in the process of saying, I need to teach this person how to literally take my position, how would you go about doing that? So that wraps up this episode, Working with Humans. Again, we talked about 4 key areas that you could work on: self-awareness, empathy, organizational awareness, and coaching and mentoring. And you can look back again as we think of this broader context of these 4 episodes, episodes 37, 38. We talked about atomic habits or building habits of action, and the corporate athlete, building routines for action. And then in episode 39, we talked about deep work. How do we do that focused work that really gets the very best work done that we need to do? So with that, I encourage you to visit my website, download the PDFs that are at the bottom of the podcast episode, and use those as tools to either capture notes as you start your exploration of these topics, or just as a refresher that you can keep at hand as you maybe go through the week and think about how can I put some of these ideas into practice. So with that, I thank you much, and thanks for listening.